I'm going to do that.
Amazing. Okay, cool.
So hopefully it's on and we're recording to the cloud now. Great.
Enjoy.
Thank you very
My
much.
head's in the cloud.
You have your head in the clouds.
We're in the cloud.
What does that mean?
I have to laugh about this thing called the cloud. I had no idea what the cloud was.
It's the cloud.
It's just another name for the server out there.
If you traveled with the Israelites through the desert for 40 years, you know exactly what the cloud is. It led them during the
Right.
night.
And the pillar of fire.
You got it. All right.
Wait, I don't have video. Ah, there we
Tried
are.
so many times to explain to me about the cloud that I have no idea. But I like that explanation about going through the desert.
Well, that's the description. I'm not making anything up.
Right.
We had the cloud before anybody else did.
Okay, I'm gonna wait just another couple of minutes and then we'll start. What I would ask for those of you who've just come on, if you have a chumash at home that you have access to, that would be great. I'm gonna put on the screen the verses we're gonna be using, but it'll be helpful if you can have the chumash because I have a couple of things I want to put on the screen. So,
David! Michael, can you tell us where to start so I've got time to look it up? I mean, which section you want first?
well, if I tell you that, it kind of gives things away in advance, man. You'll manage. Don't worry. You'll manage.
It has something to do with matzah.
It's got nothing to do with matzah, to be honest.
Hey, where are you?
As a guess.
Pesach is still a little distant from me. Okay, it's 9:30. We're going to start. So again, first of all, Bruchim Habayim, Chodesh Tov. Welcome, everybody. Delighted to have you with us on another Thursday morning of study. And hopefully we'll continue this in whatever format, whether it's in person or virtual, whatever works. And it's a pleasure to see your faces. Those of you who are a little bit shy and intimidated and perhaps suffering from excess vanity, feel at some point free to expose us to your video, at least to your picture. So don't be shy here. It's okay. The other thing is I'm going to try something a little bit different today, and I'm going to start for a few minutes and talk for a few minutes, and then I'm going to give you a bit of an assignment to work in smaller groups. So we have this thing on Zoom called breakout rooms. I'm going to divide you into breakout rooms, but it's going to be randomly. It's not people of your choosing. There is a way to do it custom, but I don't want to do that. I just want to put 3 or 4 people together in a room, and you'll have a series of questions and texts to use over a period of about, let's say 10, 15 minutes or something, and then we'll get back together and perhaps one from each of the groups can share some of the conclusions they came to. I don't want to go beyond 10 o'clock. Rabbi Galinkin does have a special class on Pesach today that probably be worth tuning into. So I'll try to finish as close to 10 o'clock as possible.
Did you send the link for that, Galinkin?
I'll try to get a hold of the link. You could probably find it on the Merkaz Olami website or maybe the RA site. I'll try to find it for you while we're talking, okay, while you're in the breakout rooms. All right. So there's some fascinating things about this week's Parsha, as you can all imagine, when we begin talking about different types of sacrifices, Parshat Vayikra. I want to focus less on the sacrifice and on one of the elements that I hadn't really paid attention to before. I've noticed it every time I read, and I kind of paused for a moment, said, what's that all about? But I never really explored it. And it was brought to my attention when I looked at a posting by Rabbi Tim Daniel Bernard, who's actually in charge of virtual and engagement activities at JTS, so very appropriate time and title for him. And he brought my attention to something that I want to try to explore with all of you today a bit. I'm going to read a verse. You don't have that one in front of you, and you don't need your Chumashim yet. But this verse, as I said, it has an element in it that's a little bit odd. It's taken from Vayikra, chapter 2, verse 13. After the introduction to the sacrifices, before they actually beginning to give the various types of sacrifices, whether it's Zevach Shlamim, Olah, whatever. So the verse goes like this. V'chol korban minchatcha b'melach timlach v'lo tashbit. Melach brit Elohecha al minchatecha al kol korbancha takriv melach. You shall salt every meal offering with salt. You may not.
May I suggest everyone go on mute, because unfortunately, Michael, at least the way I hear it, it's very muffled because of other background noise.
I'm going to mute everybody right now in the time being, and keep yourselves on mute, okay? But I've muted everybody for the time being. So I'll read that verse again in the English. You shall salt every meal offering with salt. You may not discontinue the salt of your God's covenant from upon your meal offering. On your every offering you offer salt. So as I said, in the breakout rooms, because it's very difficult to conduct a discussion with everyone, it's somewhat fascinating that we have this idea of Brit Melach Elohecha. First of all, the idea that salt is placed on everything. I mean, we love seasoning. We like things that have taste to it. So it makes a lot of sense that anything we offer in terms of a sacrifice, and interestingly, not necessarily only meat or flesh sacrifices, but also grain sacrifices have that requirement of adding salt to it. But the most important word here that Rabbi Bernard brings to the attention is the fact that it's called the salt of your God's covenant, a covenant of salt. Now, what is a covenant of salt, if you think about it? What's all of a sudden? We talk about various covenants in the Torah, and we'll come back to that in a moment, but the idea that salt has some kind of connection with a covenant with God. And so part of the explanation, of course, is trying to understand exactly what covenant is about, how that ties in with sacrifice, and why sacrifice is not necessarily the ultimate, but a very significant, meaningful expression of one of our covenants with God. And just this idea of salt, there are different things. We read of salt in different contexts in the Tanakh, certainly in the Torah. And salt, of course, in ancient times served what purpose? This is rhetorical, you don't have to answer. Salt was the best preservative in ancient times. That's what they used to preserve food, preserve various items. So they would salt them and keep them there. So in a sense, this idea that salt as a preservative, as something that maintains, you might even say sustains, is perhaps a very appropriate metaphor, and in this case, a very tangible one, used to describe and apply to every sacrifice that we bring. This idea that our covenant of sacrifices with God needs to have this element of sustainability, of being able to be maintained through the preservative, at least in a metaphorical sense, of salt. And that's one fascinating explanation. And of course, salt was something used at meals. And where did people perhaps cement or at least initiate some type of covenant between them? And we'll come back to try and understand exactly what that means. But at meals, people did this at meals. And the idea of sharing a meal with somebody, whether it's through sacrifice to God or inviting people over for dinner, don't do it nowadays, is something that allows us to perhaps explore relationship, covenant, in a way that makes it more meaningful and perhaps more sustainable as well. So those are two elements of this idea of salt being so significant, a part of covenant with God. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to put a couple of pages up, or one of the pages up on the screen. And as I said, it's easier if you have a chumash with you. And even if only one among each of you has a chumash, that'll be fine. They can read the verse, but I'll put up the verses as well. And what I'd like you to do is answer a number of questions. So I'm just going to put it up on my share screen right now so you can see what I'm talking about, if I can find it. So what I'd like us to do is, I think the idea of salt is fascinating. The idea of sacrifices are fascinating. But I would like for us to explore a little more, what exactly does it mean to have a covenant? What is a covenant? I'll just make this a little more visible. 1 second. Sorry, guys. There we go. So I'd like you to answer a series of questions once I put you into these small breakout rooms. I'll put 4 people in a room. That should be fine. So I want you to try to define what is your understanding of covenant? What is a covenant? I've given you a little bit of a hint through discussion, at least briefly, about this idea of a salt covenant and its connection with sacrifices. But I'd like you to talk about what is a covenant? What does it mean? What's unique about a covenant that you might not have in some other relational description? So that's perhaps a more general assignment, gets us some definition, understanding in general what a covenant is. And then I'd like you to try to explore and recall different covenants there are in the Jewish biblical historical experience. What do I mean by that? I'm not going to give you examples because you'll find that on your own, but it's not as if there's one covenant between Israel and God. There are a whole series of covenants that are described and initiated throughout the biblical experience. I've given it some examples in the verses that I've offered you. So I want you to try to explore those and maybe get a better definition of what covenants there are, and perhaps answer the question as well at the same time, why are there so many different covenants? Why isn't one covenant good enough between God and Israel? And lastly, since we're talking about biblical historical experience, what is the meaning of covenant today in Judaism? Is that something that's even relevant anymore? Is that something that people understand about their relationship within Judaism, either among people or with God? So is that something that you even use today, other than in a cursory way or other than in an offhanded way when describing something that was initially biblical, and perhaps it no longer has the same significance it had then, or not at all? So that's something I'd like you to explore. And underneath here is a list of 6 different places in just in the Torah. There are others in the rest of the Tanakh. We'll leave those for now. I'd like you to take a look at least a few of those. They give different instances of different covenants that were established. Okay, so I'm going to leave that on the screen. You might want to perhaps copy down those verses or take a screenshot of that as well, because what I'll do afterwards, I'm going to put up the list of verses just in case there isn't even one in each group of 4 that has a chumash. So I'll put those up in a moment. But the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to break you into breakout rooms, and I'll be honest, I haven't done this before, so I hope it's going to work properly. It should be okay. Let's see what happens. Okay, so there are 23 participants. I'm going to put you into 5 different rooms. All right, it's going to do it automatically. And if you want, you can chat, write me a note, or if there's any issue with accessing a chumash or the verses, I'll put up on share screen. Probably the best way to communicate if any of the groups are having an issue is to chat with me, send me a message, and I'll try to help out. All right, so I'm going to create the rooms. It's going to do it randomly. Just follow the same rules when you're discussing things among yourselves. Make sure that if you're all not on mute, then just speak one at a time, and that'll probably be the easiest. Okay, here we go. Okay, there are the divisions, and I'm opening up all the rooms. And so what I'd ask you need to join the room. You'll get an invitation, join your breakout room, and see how it works. Looking good so far. Okay, I still see some people haven't joined yet. Do you see the invitation to join? Okay, there we go.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Faye? Good morning.
Brenda, are you using a computer?
Yes.
So you should be able to join, but you got to press join. There should be
Well, I did press join.
You're not joined yet, though, I see. Oh, no, sorry, you are. It's another Brenda. My apologies.
Okay, and I can't, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but you should be able to hear the other people in your room.
I can't. I have Faye Major on the screen, but I can't hear her. I can't hear anybody from the group. They have to unmute or they have to join?
Maybe they have to unmute, or they're all joined.
Nope. Still can't hear them.
Let's see.
Isn't technology wonderful?
That's not what I want. I'm not sure why. Okay, Brenda, can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, I'm going to try moving you to another room, see if that works.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Still can't hear them.
Not sure why, Brenda, sorry.
I don't know why either. I'm just as lost as you are. It's odd because you and I can hear each other, but I can't hear anybody else.
Okay, so those of you who don't have, you can probably hear me, but those of you who don't have the verses, they're on share screen now. Okay, so hopefully everybody can hear me. In another minute or so, I'm going to bring you all back into the main conversation. So whatever you're doing, try. It doesn't matter if you haven't covered all the verses, even if you did one or two of them, that's fine. So just kind of wrap things up in the next minute, and then I'll bring everybody back into the main conversation. So you should have a screen that's telling you in about 10 seconds the breakout rooms are going to end, and we'll all be back together in the main room. Okay, so everybody's back. They look like they haven't suffered anything traumatic over the last 15 minutes, hopefully. So I managed to sit in on each of the rooms, at least for a few seconds, just to really make sure technically it was working. I was glad to see that people were able to have a conversation. Again, the technology is new. It's new to me as well and to all of us, but I think there's an effectiveness to be able to discuss things as opposed to just listening that is a little bit more challenging when all of us together. So perhaps if maybe one from each of the groups would just like to share very briefly one aspect that you spoke about. Don't try to summarize everything you talked about, but maybe one point of interest that came up. So if decide just perhaps one person from each group, turn off your mute, and if there's something you'd just like to share, well, again, one point, not a whole Megillah, so to speak, then please feel free to go ahead.
One of the key things is that there's no one covenant. A covenant is a number of different covenants at different points in time, and each one has its own set of requirements or mitzvahs.
Okay, great. Anyone else?
Michael, I didn't get to go into the group because I couldn't hear anybody.
Okay. Did you have a chance to think of
Well, I
something?
had a chance to read Shemot 31:16. It talked about salt, and salt was a very highly valued commodity at the time of the Torah, and it's still today considered a very highly valued commodity in Judaism, because it's the prime ingredient that is used every Shabbat, as John had said, to put on the challah when we do hamotzi. But also salt is a sign of sustainability, which I believe is really what the Israelites were all about and what we're all about. And even in these difficult times, as we're all experiencing, I think that's what we have to think about, is that we have to sustain, and we have to use the salt as our symbol to sustain.
Great. Okay, thanks, Brenda. Anyone else?
Maybe I'll speak for my group. We thought that an agreement has a limitation, usually like 99 years or something like that. But we thought a covenant is eternal, and it's usually with a large group, whereas an agreement can be just with one or two people. But a covenant is with a group, and it's something very special with God.
Okay. Anyone else have any other opinions about the nature of covenant?
Well, as I'll say, as far as the covenant, the main ones that we practice are circumcision and Shabbat, which we wouldn't be a people if we didn't continue to honor this covenant with God.
Okay.
And I think that goes back to sustainability again.
Yeah.
It's these covenants that we continue to practice, that we've been practicing now for over 3,000 years, that tell us something. We're still here. We're not big in numbers, but we have sustained, and I think that's important today.
Okay. Anyone else? Because as I said, I wanted to try to finish close to 10 to enable those who are interested in listening on Rabbi Galinskin's shiur. So if anyone else has anything else they'd like to share?
So one of the things that we talked about in terms of the covenant is that the covenant is an agreement that has two parts. One party agrees to one thing. If the other party will agree to something else, you get together and you have a covenant or an agreement. And the Brit Milah and keeping the Shabbat, those are actually tokens of the covenant. They are not the covenant themselves. They are tokens of the underlying covenant between Jews and God, or Hebrews and God at the time.
Okay, so let me just add a few other points. This is something that we probably will do as a more serious session. This is really just to explore a little bit the idea of covenant and to acknowledge and be aware of the fact that there's an incredible variety of covenant and interpretation and expression of covenant in our tradition, specifically in the Bible, but certainly there, if we were to trace the idea of covenant throughout Jewish history, there are all sorts of different ways that that has taken on expression and significance in the political realm and the social realm, and that's really a discussion, more detailed discussion for another day. Just the last few points I'd like to mention is that when we talk about covenant, as opposed to perhaps contract, agreement, there's an understanding, and this is a different commentators, there's this understanding that a covenant has a certain dynamism to it, meaning it may have been established in certain circumstances with a certain understanding, but a covenant is something that can change over time, because if you think about it, at least if we specifically relate to the covenant between God and the people of Israel, first of all, you have these varied expressions of it. You have the idea of circumcision, which is not wholly inclusive. It only involves men, really. So that's not a wholly inclusive covenant. We have the covenant of Shabbat that you mentioned before, this covenant of salt, of sacrifice. We have the covenant with Noah, the idea of the rainbow, which is a covenant for all humanity. The fact that God will not repeat the destruction of all humanity and the earth through this covenant. Does it mean that both sides throughout history, whether biblical or otherwise, have maintained all the terms of that covenant throughout? No. Does that dissolve the covenant?
No.
No. The covenant as is something that continues to exist, and it has a certain dynamic to it, meaning circumstances change, and that covenant has to be re-explored. Perhaps the most significant element, at least in these times for a covenant, is that a covenant is an inclusive, or should be an inclusive type of relational agreement between people and God, and everyone who's part of that covenant, whether it's through kinship, meaning they were born into it, or by consent, they've taken upon themselves that covenant, even if they began from without, means that they're part of that agreement and means that they are to be included in any understanding of a collective. And what do I mean by that? Everybody who's part of that covenant needs to be considered part of the group, and their needs should need to be considered as well when we're discussing the significance of the covenant or of Judaism. So when we talk about today covenant, we have a covenant, an understanding among us as Jews of certain things we have in common, as difficult as that is to find, something that's universal to all Jews. But this idea that we belong to a group perhaps is the most fundamental element. How we define our place within that group, how we define our expression of custom, of tradition within that group is all part of that, but the idea of belonging to a group is the essence. And I think in our day, meaning in these days of COVID-19, we have to remember that everybody within our community is part of that covenant. We have a congregational covenant, we have a national covenant, and when we decide and understand what the responsibilities and expectations are, the bottom line has to be that everybody is within that. So we can't exclude. We have to make sure that we're doing everything to make sure that we see others within that covenant in a sense, equal members as we are. Whether they do the same things, whether they express it with the same emotional or practical integrity is not the issue. The fact that they see themselves as part, however they describe and express that, we need to acknowledge they're being part of that covenant as well. And so it's really a call for continually exploring what that covenant means. And the last question I ask you, how is it relevant today? Well, we have to find how it's relevant today. But you have to start from the initial understanding and acknowledgement that everybody's part of that covenant, who's taken on either through kinship or consent to be part of that group. And you can't leave out others through disagreement or through negligence. They all have to be part of that group and seen as members of that group. And that's why it's our responsibility within our perhaps congregational covenant to make sure that we continue to include everyone that we can, whether it's calling people, inviting them to attend virtual sessions, and just making sure they're okay. So hopefully this idea of covenant is something that all of us are able to translate and express into these particular times of crisis to make sure that we respect everyone's place, whatever that may be, within that covenantal arrangement. So I want to thank all of you for joining today, and hope you all have a safe, I've changed my sign-off things. I said before safe, healthy, and engaged. I'm saying safe, responsible, and engaged, and hope that is true for all of us.
Well said, Michael. Well said.
Thank you. And where can we find that link to Galinkin's Zoom?
Well done.
I didn't get a chance to find it, but I'll see if I can. And if we can, we'll get it up on the website. I'm sure it's something that's going to be recorded and that will be accessible afterwards. So if you can't find it immediately, then don't worry. We'll make sure we get that to you in an email or put it up on our website.
Thank you, Michael. Well said.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you so much for the
Have a wonderful day as much as possible.
Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Michael.
Take care, everybody.
You too. Everybody stay healthy and stay engaged.
Bye, Lynn.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Anna. It's Brenda.
Bye, Anna.
Bye-bye.
Okay.